as we continue the King of Kings teaching series on the book of Daniel. And if you are tracking along with the series, you know the title is Resolved. And this is a great word. It's a great term of choice. It's a term of making a decision. Resolved is the term. And if you've been with the series, you know this. And if you're new to the series, you need to know this. This word resolves comes from the very first chapter of the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. We're going to put this verse on the screen for you. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. So this teaching series named Resolved is based upon the idea that Daniel said, I want to serve God no matter what. I want to serve God if it's popular, and I want to serve God if it's not popular. He resolved to do that. Your different English translations may have a different type of wording, but the idea sometimes is expressed: Daniel resolved, Daniel made up his mind, Daniel purposed in his heart, Daniel determined. These are the ideas that the word leb is the word in the Hebrew text. It's his heart. So while it may say in your English translation he made up his mind, understand that it started in his heart. It started there, and then it affected his mind. This verb, sim, that is the idea of translated into resolved. It's an interesting word. It means to put you in a specific place, to appoint you, to make a decision, to resolve. And of course, here in Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel made a decision. He put himself in the place of walking with God. But I found it interesting, and we want to show you a couple of places where this verb is used other than in the book of Daniel. Who did it speak of? Deuteronomy chapter 32 says, when Moses had finished speaking all these words to Israel, he said to them, take to your heart all the words which I am commanding you today. Moses told the people, you need to resolve. You need to take to your heart. You need to make a decision that you're going to do what the Lord asked you to do. So not only Daniel did this resolve, Moses told the people of Israel to resolve, but I found it very interesting in the book of Job. Remember that conversation the Lord has with the enemy, Satan? And a lot of us have been troubled by this idea that the Lord said, have you considered my servant Job? But that same verb, have you considered, have you appointed, have you made Job a candidate for your temptations, for your attacks? God used this same word to say, I know the heart of my servant Job. Satan, why don't you test him and see if his heart is true? Here, Pastor Chad's been walking through the book of Daniel chapter by chapter. Of course, last chapter of last week was chapter 7. We're going to study chapter 8 tonight. And I want you to know that there's a break in the original text. Simplified statement. The first 7 chapters were written in Aramaic originally, the language for the Gentiles. Starting in chapter 8, where we pick up tonight, through chapter 12, written in Hebrew originally for the Jewish people. So this is a specific word for a specific group of people. You may know that Daniel served under 4 different kings. You've heard of that famous guy, King Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son Belshazzar, then Darius and Cyrus. So Daniel lived a long life. He served under 4 different kings in Babylon. And now if you have your scriptures or have your phone, I'd like us to read through chapter 8 of Daniel and see what we can do to resolve to honor the Lord. Let's start in, of course, verse 1 of Daniel 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me. We read chapter 7 last week. It says that was the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. So it's 2 years later. Another vision comes to Daniel, chapter 8, verse 1. It was the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king. And a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa. In his heart and in his mind, in the vision, he's in a different place, which is in the province of Elam. He says, I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal, a river there in the city. And we're going to put a map for you right here to show you where Susa is in the Babylonian kingdom. And you may know that as you get ready for your Purim party in a couple of weeks, the Persian king Xerxes built his palace in the same place about 100 years after the Daniel story. This is where the Queen Esther story takes place, in this same city of Susa. And also Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes in this very same city. So this is the mental picture that Daniel has in the vision. So we'll keep reading verse 3. He said, I lifted my gaze and I looked, and behold, there was a ram which had 2 horns standing in front of the canal. The 2 horns were long. One was longer than the other, with the other one coming up last. Now we know this is a prophecy, and we know it's imagery, and so we have to follow the picture in our mind, and we have to determine what the interpretation might be. He says, I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward. No other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone else to rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. So we have animals are representative of kingdoms and leaders, and we'll give you the interpretation because it's given to us right here in the text. Verse 5, Daniel continues, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west. Well, if you're in Babylon, or even if you're in Israel, the west is Europe, coming that direction. From the west, over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. It's a way to say how fast they were moving. It's like you're running so fast your feet don't touch the ground. It's a speedy attack from this military. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and he came up to the ram that had the 2 horns. That was the first animal we were told about. Daniel said, and he rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I'm no artist, but I like artists, and they gave us one interpretation of what this might look like. On the right side was the kingdom with 2 horns, and then one rose up with a single horn coming to attack. This is what it might have looked like in Daniel's mind. So there's going to be a confrontation between militaries, between empires. We'll keep reading. Daniel 8, verse 7. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns. So one kingdom going against a combined kingdom of 2 nations, and the single just defeated the double. So there is a new empire in charge. He struck the ram, shattered his 2 horns. The ram had no strength to withstand him. And you may be thinking, who are these empires? Well, we'll read it in just a moment. So he hurled him to the ground, trampled on him. There was none to rescue the ram from his power. And so, feeling victorious, verse 8, the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. He was proud. But as soon as he was mighty, as soon as he was elevated to power, it says, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So you have a kingdom with 2 leaders, defeated by a kingdom with 1 leader, who is exceedingly proud of his achievement, but his power is short-lived, and now he will be replaced with a kingdom divided into 4. So who do these animals represent? Well, we're going to learn that Alexander the Great is the one with the speedy army coming from the west. He defeats the power of 2 combined empires called the Medes and the Persians. And he defeats them. In the year 336, he begins his conquests. 336 BC. Now, continuing in chapter 8, verse 9, the vision of Daniel continues. Out of one of them, one of the 4, came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land, the holy land, the promised land of Israel. And it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. So you see an attack on the beautiful land, an attack on the land of promise, causing suffering, causing them to be trampled down. And the leader of this new empire, like Alexander the Great, was described here in verse 11. It magnified himself to be equal with the commander of the host. You know, leaders who don't know God often think they are God. And it removed the regular sacrifice, the Jewish sacrificial system, from him, and the place of his sanctuary, the temple itself, was thrown down. Verse 12, on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn with the regular sacrifice. It will fling truth or scripture, the word of God, to the ground and perform its will and prosper. And you can imagine how confused and maybe concerned Daniel is, living in exile from the land of Israel, but his heart is there, trying to figure out what the vision says. In verse 13, I heard a holy one, an angel speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? How long will the destruction, the attack on the holy land continue? And Daniel asked this question of the angel, and he got a very specific answer. Verse 14, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place, the temple, will be restored. So if you were Daniel in this moment, I'm very confident that you would say the same thing he says in verse 15. It came about when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. What is this all about? What am I supposed to learn from this? And behold, one who was standing before me looked like a man. I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the river, the Ulai Canal, and he said to angel Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. See, God said, I've got a plan for you, but I'm not going to leave you with question marks. I'm going to give you interpretation of the vision. So he came near, Daniel's testimony, he came near to where I was standing. We're now verse 17. And when he came, I was frightened and I fell on my face. But he said to me, son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. You need to see this phrase, because it's going to happen multiple times in just a few verses. The time of the end. The angel Gabriel says to Daniel, I'm giving you the chance to look way into the future. We serve the God who knows the end from the beginning. So this is a mystery to Daniel. It's not a mystery to the Lord. He says, I'm going to show you things that pertain to the time of the end. Now, while he was talking to me, verse 18, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and he made me stand upright. And he said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur. And here's another phrase, at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Now, there's lots of prophecies in your scriptures. And maybe you have felt a vision from the Lord. And sometimes we get very clear interpretation. Sometimes we don't. But in this case, we don't have to guess what the answers are. The Lord in the scriptures gives us a very simple, very clear description of what these animals represent, what the vision is. Daniel 8, verse 20. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia, the Medes and Persians. That's the animal that had the two horns. The ram which you saw, the one that had the big horn in the center, represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, and we now know his name, Alexander the Great. He conquered half of the globe, and he died at the age of 32. Remember what he was called? They ran as if their feet didn't touch the ground. That's a fast empire. In about 11 years, from his early 20s to his early 30s, he conquered half the globe. But the vision continues. History moves forward. Verse 22, the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. A couple of maps for you right here. We have one of Alexander the Great's kingdoms. Look at that. All of that, by the time you're age 32, you've conquered this part of the world. But again, age 32, he passes away. And what happens when kings die? There's a fight for the territory. And so this scripture says, the four horns arose, verse 22, to represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. So after his death, there was a battle, and these guys named Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysicamus, and Seleucus, they fought for and divided the kingdom up. So we can see on the map what was prophesied 200 years before this series of battles is exactly what came to pass. One guy had it all, then four guys fought for it, and so they had less power than Alexander did. Now we're at verse 23. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. Please note this statement, verse 24. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. What does this mean? This is going to be spiritual power. In this case, demonic spiritual power. Alexander was described as the swift leader, powerful leader, but it didn't say he didn't do that in his own power. This one has power that's not his own. And what will this leader do? Verse 24, he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, dominating different places. He will prosper. He will perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. But not only will he be militarily powerful, verse 25, and through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will try to defeat you militarily, but also he will lie to you. And not surprisingly, it says he will magnify himself in his heart. Remember, leaders who don't love God think they are God. And verse 25 at the end says he will destroy many while they are at ease. You know what this means? There's been some sort of ceasefire, some sort of peace agreement, some sort of treaty that he doesn't abide by. And imagine the arrogance, imagine the pride. Now he will even oppose the prince of princes. Or maybe more familiar to you, he will oppose the King of Kings, Yeshua HaMashiach. But he will be broken without human agency. See, it said in verse 24, his power will be mighty, but not by his own power. And then he will be defeated, but not by human power. Verse 26, the vision of the evenings and the mornings which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret. More so, keep the vision preserved. It's not that it's not supposed to be shared. Make sure it doesn't get lost. Make sure you don't forget this, for it pertains to many days in the future. Now, when you study Bible prophecy, there are often instances where you have what's called near-term fulfillment of prophecy and long-term fulfillment of prophecy. And we'll go ahead and give you the final answer. We're going to talk about what's known as the Antichrist. This is the long-term fulfillment of prophecy, but there is a nearer-term fulfillment of prophecy by a guy who's called Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes becomes the near-term fulfillment. So 551 BC is the time Daniel's having this vision. But if you were to jump forward in time, almost 400 years, you would learn about this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes who comes to power in 175 BC. And you know how he got control of the Seleucid dynasty? He murdered his own brother. Well, Ptolemy is in Egypt. He's trying to regain some power. He doesn't think this new leader, Antiochus, is strong. So the guy from Egypt, Ptolemy, tries to recover territory. And Antiochus instead invades Egypt, defeats Ptolemy, proclaims himself king in Egypt. So in chapter 8, verse 9, it says, one of them grew exceedingly great toward the south. Well, you know, if you're standing in the land of Israel, what's to the south? Egypt. So he's now in control of Egypt, but trouble breaks out in Jerusalem. So he tries to do the next part of chapter 8, verse 9, toward the beautiful land. He makes that the target of his conquest. The people were subjugated. The temple was desecrated. The temple treasury was plundered. He tries to return to Egypt, but he's forced to evacuate. And so he has a kingdom to the north of Israel. He's trying to control Egypt, but he's got competition. He's got rivals to the south. So you know what he tries to do? He tries to create a buffer zone. And that buffer zone is the land of Israel. So what does he do? He attacks Jerusalem. He burns the city. He kills lots and lots of people. The Jews who survived were forbidden to follow Mosaic law. They were forbidden to observe the Shabbat or their feasts. They were forbidden to have their sacrifices, to circumcise their children. Altars to idols were set up, pagan altars in Jerusalem. And in December of 167 BC, the Jews were ordered to offer unclean sacrifices and eat swine, pig, or be penalized by death. And if you know your history, you know where we're headed very soon in the story. Remember what was said in chapter 8, verse 14? It said there would be 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, that equates to 1,150 days, which is 3 years and 70 days. And guess what? If you put it on a timeline, from the time the temple was desecrated in December of 167 BC to the time the temple was restored under the Maccabees, what you and I know as the Hanukkah story, 1,150 days works out on the calendar. 2,300 evenings and mornings. So what we learn in the near-term fulfillment of prophecy will also apply to the long-term fulfillment of prophecy. So we're looking to the end of the times, it says, or what you and I have come to call the Antichrist. And we learn a little bit about what that person, demonically possessed person, will do because of the actions of Antiochus. In fact, we have a list we'll put up here for you. He will achieve great power by subduing others. He will rise to power promising false security. Remember the so-called peace treaty that will occur in the end of days? He will be intelligent and persuasive. He'll be controlled by the enemy, Satan himself. Will be an adversary of Israel. Will attempt to subjugate Israel to his own authority. He will rise up against the Prince of Princes, Yeshua himself. But just like it was said here, his rule will be terminated by the power of God. When you look ahead to the end of days, still in the future for us, this Antichrist figure has lots of names. The most familiar one comes from 1 John chapter 2, the Antichrist, but he's called Here in the passage you read last week, Daniel 7, he's called the little horn. Here in Daniel 8, he's called the fierce king. He's called the master of intrigue or the master of deceit. Next chapter, chapter 9, he'll be called the prince who is to come. Zechariah calls him the worthless shepherd. 2 Thessalonians calls him the man of lawlessness and the one who brings destruction. And Revelation 13 calls him the beast. Because God said, I want you, Daniel, to understand what's going to happen at the end of times. And he makes it very apparent that not only does God know what happens in the future, God is sovereign in the future. So while we look to the future and have question marks, God doesn't. Again, he sees the end from the beginning. So we've walked through a whole series of visions, and if you are like Daniel, how would you feel at this moment? I think you know exactly how he feels, because look what he says at the last verse of the chapter. I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Imagine the weight on your shoulders of having a sense of how much evil is coming in the future. Exhausted and sick for days. So if you are exhausted and sick for days, what you are tempted to do is give up. It's too hard. So what did Daniel say? Then I got up again and carried on the king's business. But I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. See, Daniel didn't have a PowerPoint with a map showing Alexander's conquest. But we do. Guess what? Sometimes you may be exhausted and sick for days. But the person who is resolved says, I have to get up and carry out the king's business. So I'm going to ask you to join me in being a person who is resolved. Let's join Daniel and say a couple of statements in our own heart. I am resolved to entrust my future to the God who knows the end from the beginning. I don't want a God who knows less than I do. I don't want a God who knows a little bit more than I do. I want to know the God who knows the end from the beginning. I am resolved to obey God faithfully and openly, even if the culture around me rejects him. You're going to hear about the lion's den. Can I give you the spoiler story? Daniel's like 80 years old when he goes into the lion's den. He ain't going to win on his own. He's thrown in there because he chose to obey God even if the culture rejected him. And I am resolved to listen to God's voice and heart above the noise of the world. It's hard to be resolved listening to 20 voices at once in your head. If you're going to be resolved, you got to tune some of the noise out. I assume you know that in every age, God is looking for those whom he can use. What about in our age? What about us? Could we be persons who are followers of Yeshua and say, I am resolved? I am resolved when it's popular, and I'm resolved when it's not popular. Now, we don't have the same experience Daniel had. We probably don't get these amazingly detailed visions with detailed explanations of them. But what if you're resolved? What if I'm resolved? What does a person who's resolved look like in this culture? So I want to tell you a story of my family. When I was early in high school, my father left the corporate world and he founded a prison ministry. A ministry to begin Bible studies, discipleship classes, parenting classes in prisons all throughout Texas. So I'm 14 or 15 years old, and my dad begins this ministry, and he kept telling me that when you turn 18, you're going to be eligible to be a volunteer chaplain in the prison, so I'm going to take you with me. So a 14-year-old says, sure. So then I turn 18, and I went to prison. As a visitor, you understand, but I went to prison at the age of 18, And my father would lead some of the services. There were other ministers who would lead the services. So during my senior year of high school, almost every Saturday, my dad and I would drive about 2 hours one way to a prison, and we would minister there. Minister in what in prison lingo is called administrative segregation. You know the term better as solitary confinement. But there were also situations where there were church services. And so on this Saturday, there was a church service, and we were in the chapel. And you understand how prison crowd control works. You bring in the inmates from different housing areas. They're called pods. But you bring them in sequentially. Not everybody arrives at once. You got to do crowd control. So this group arrives, and then you wait, and this group arrives, and you wait for this group to arrive. And it's a long time from when the first person arrives to when the service starts. So here I am. I've been in prison ministry. You know, I'm an expert. I've been in it like 6 weeks or so. And I see a guy standing over there by himself. And so I decide to go over and say hello. So I walk over to this guy. I might need to remind you, he was a little bit bigger than I was. And I said, "Hi, how you doing?" He said, "Fine." I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Dallas." I said, "Me too. That's really cool." Can I tell you, he was just thrilled to be talking to me at this moment. So then we're still waiting for the different groups to arrive, and finally it's time for the service, and I walked back to this guy, and I said, "Hey, do you have anybody to sit with?" Has anybody ever looked at you like you just asked the stupidest question in history? I said, "Do you have anybody to sit with?" And he said, "No." I said, "Okay, why don't you come sit with me?" He was thrilled at my invitation. He comes and sits down with me. Music is playing, and then the preacher is starting to teach. And he didn't have a Bible, so I had a Bible with me. In fact, I had this Bible with me. And he couldn't read very well, so I was showing him the words and trying to explain some of the words to him. The service finishes. He gets up to leave. I said, "Hey, I'll be back next Saturday. You come back and sit with me." And again, he's just thrilled at my invitation. So he gets up, he walks all the way to the door, and he stops. And he comes back to me, and he says, "Hey, why'd you come talk to me anyway?" And I said, "Well, you were just standing over there by yourself. I thought I'd come say hello." He said, "Most people wouldn't have done that." I said, "Why?" He said, "My name is Killer Jackson." I said, "Well, I'm Trey. Nice to meet you." He leaves. The next Saturday, my dad and I go back. He comes to church. The next Saturday we come back, he comes to church. The next week, I bought him a Bible, a little kitty Bible with all the pictures in it. You know, he was mad at that, but I gave him a little Bible. Okay? For like 6, 7, 8 weeks in a row, we sat there in church. And then after that, he stopped coming. So I would go back the next Saturday, say, "Where's Jackson?" I don't know. "Where's Jackson?" I don't know. He never came back. So I finished high school. My prison ministry career is over. I go off to college. We live in Texas. I go to college in New York. It's kind of far away. I come home from college at Thanksgiving. I've been away from home for about 4 months. Fly from New York to Dallas, go to the airport, head home, first stop, Mexican food. Just like fly home from Israel, first stop, go to Mexican food. Go home to my parents' house. The phone rings. Now, my 16-year-old daughter is here, so I have to explain. This was called a landline. This was a phone that sat on a desk that had this long string that went into the wall. So we walk in the house after going to dinner, walk in, my dad answers the phone, he says hello, and then he says, "Trey, it's for you. I don't live there anymore, and nobody knows I'm in town." He says, "The phone's for you." I pick up the phone. I said, "Hello, Trey?" "Yes." "This is Kenneth Jackson." I said, "Killer Jackson?" "Yeah, I want you to know something." "Okay." He said, "I want you to know something. I got out yesterday." Now I'm wondering what that has to do with me. He said, I got out yesterday and I want you to know something. What? I want you to know I got a job. I joined a church. And I'm taking care of my little girl. And I said, thank you, God. We talked on the phone for about 5 minutes. We hung up. I've never seen him again. Unless he's here tonight, I guess. I've never seen him again more than 20 years later. I've thought of that story. I've told that story, but I never had a word for that story until tonight. My dad resolved to leave his business and start a ministry. My dad resolved to take his son into ministry with him. My opportunity was to say, I'm resolved to try to tell the grace of Yeshua to somebody that the world might not give grace to. And then Kenneth Jackson resolved to change his life and live for the Messiah. So I've had that story for all these years, but I never had the word until resolved. My dad resolved. He taught me what it looks like to be resolved. But my part of the story is not the important part. There's a daughter of Kenneth Jackson out there someday, somewhere, who let's hope she's resolved because her dad resolved. I'm following God no matter what my past looked like. May we be resolved for the Messiah.